Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Driving into the Future, Why Electric and Why Now? We will be looking at why electric vehicles are suddenly on the rise and explaining some of the forces propelling electric vehicles into the public discussion. So first, I'm going to walk a little bit through the outline of this webinar. I'm going to begin with introducing the presenters, and then I'll briefly touch on the sustainability framework and its relevancy to framing electric vehicles. I'll follow that up with discussing the sustainability benefits of EVs, and then move into discussing electric vehicles themselves. I'll wrap up with touching on supply chain concerns, followed by the conclusion, and leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So this webinar is presented by me, Jeremy Erdman, of the 43rd Legislative District, with the support of Chittum of the 8th Legislative District and Dean of the 32nd Legislative District. And as the bio states, I work with organizations in multiple sectors with varying objectives on sustainable products, systems, and initiatives. The organizations that I work with are shown with their logos below, and Cultura, related to electric vehicles, is one of them. And if anyone has questions or comments after the webinar, please feel free to contact me at jeremy@cultura.org. Now, I briefly want to establish what sustainability means in the context of this webinar. Sustainability refers to solutions or products that address or improve the environment, people's well-being, and economic prosperity. So this presentation is going to show the ways that electric vehicles improve in these different three areas. So moving on to the environmental benefits, one of the primary drivers towards electric vehicles is our need to reduce the use of fossil fuels to decrease our carbon emissions. Scientists have set 2 degrees Celsius of warming as our limit to prevent the most destructive and irreversible of climate damage. Unburnable carbon has set that in order to keep the chance of surpassing this warming to 2 degrees Celsius, we will need to emit less than, as it says here, 886 gigatons of carbon dioxide between the first half of this century. And we have already blown through over a third of that budget during the first fifth of this half century in this time period, which means that we need to rapidly decarbonize. And in direct relation to oil and transportation, about 80% of the world's known fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground. And that means that we need to transition away from fossil fuels rather quickly. And so, to address the impending threat of climate change, 196 parties made a pact to reduce their emissions and limit the rise of global temperatures. As nations have moved forward, we have seen countries ranging from Norway to France to China, India, the UK, and Netherlands pledge to ban the use of gasoline and diesel-powered vehicles. These steps are going to help reduce their emissions, but it's also going to boost the demand for alternative technologies like electric vehicles. And this boost in demand will propel innovation, and it's going to make it easier for everyone to adopt these technologies as newer and newer forms of transportation technology becomes available. And so building on this momentum, multiple cities have signed the C40 Cities pledge. A part of this pledge states that for these cities listed here, a major area of their cities will be zero emissions by 2030. And this is a key step towards a fossil fuel free um, city and streets. And it will continue to build demand for electric vehicles beyond the countries who are already pushing towards no gasoline and diesel cars. And as you can see, these cities come from a wide range of areas around the world, and many of them outside of those um, initial countries discussed. And so I have, as a part of the C40 Cities Pledge, I have a quote from um, the director of New York City's Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And so reading this quote, like all cities, many of the challenges facing New York City are unique, but we know that solutions come from the entire globe. Sharing knowledge allows us to improve the speed up learning and deployment of climate change actions. The exchange spearheaded by the global C40 low emissions vehicle network allows collaborating cities to share innovations and learn from each other. As, for example, we have applied valuable lessons from Bogota and Amsterdam in crafting our charging infrastructure strategy, while also sharing New York's actions to make 20% of new off-street parking EV charger ready. So the reason I included this quote and read it is that I wanted to highlight that while the world is moving towards similar goals, as they've mentioned here, the methods in which we, Washington State, will be addressing them is going to be unique. It's going to be unique across the world. We all have varying characteristics that are going to make adopting new transportation technologies slightly different for everyone. And so for Washington State, the way that we're going to address the evolution of transportation will be uniquely our own. And we do have the opportunity to design solutions that benefit everyone in the state, from Spokane to Forks and from Vancouver to Bellingham. But we're going to have to be proactive in this. And so I think we need to acknowledge that people are going to push back and say, okay, well, in different parts of the world, certain cities like New York or even within Washington State, Seattle might have an easier time making this transition. But we can push back and say, yes, of course, there's going to be unique challenges for everyone. And we know that, Eastern Washington is going to be different than maybe more remote places in the UK, which has said that they're going to ban gasoline vehicles, but we're going to need to be proactive, and we can find solutions rather than being reactive to a changing market around us. So moving on beyond the environmental benefits of transitioning away from gasoline and potentially towards electric vehicles is that there are significant health risks that with gasoline and diesel that we can avoid if we move to different fuel sources. And so one of the lesser known risks with gasoline and diesel cars is the risk to public health. An MIT study found that, as it's listed here, about 55,000 Americans die annually due to gasoline and diesel exhaust exposure. And if we compare that to the 2016 death rate for car accidents, it's 18,000 more people that have died as a result of exhaust exposure, which means that as Americans, we are more likely to die from the exhaust rather than from a car accident itself. And one of the main, of course, the health impacts come from pollution, and one of the main forms of pollution and damage comes from the particulate pollution, which, as this graphic shows from the American Lung Association, it causes significant respiratory damage, along with the potential for reproductive harm, which is then outlined even more in this graphic here, which shows also that people who live close to roadways and traffic experience a higher rate of these adverse health effects. And building on that previous slide, exposure has been linked to pregnancy, respiratory, heart, and brain problems. And based on a report from Washington State, this report actually discusses where funding or where the settlement money from the Volkswagen lawsuit would go. A lot of it is going towards electrifying public fleets and ferries. They were estimating that about 4 million Washingtonians live in some of these high-risk areas, which is over half the state's population. And if we even follow through this infographic, we see starting from pregnancy all the way towards later in life, being close to roadways and having exposure to gasoline and diesel exhaust causes a lot of different health complications throughout the course of a person's life. So then moving beyond the health, the adverse health effects of gasoline and diesel and the benefits of moving away from that, we can go more towards now the energy and economic security benefits of moving away from gasoline and diesel cars. So this line of reasoning is pushed by Republicans who support electric vehicles, and I know it's surprising, there are some who exist. State Rep Dick Murray down in the 28th Legislative District recommended looking into this think tank called Securing America's Future Energy. And that's been helpful to better understand the idea of moving away from oil and towards electric vehicles as an economic security and sort of national security issue. And I pulled, if you look over to your right, I took two banners from their website, which they use to better explain or sort of promote the economic benefits of reducing our use of foreign oil, both for our own communities, which is the oil dependence. If we have 92% of our transportation is coming from foreign oil, that puts our economy more at risk than it does if we're powering our transportation through locally generated electricity. And it causes a bigger burden for taxpayers if we're spending, as it says here, $67.5 billion to safeguard those oil supplies. And so this line of reasoning and securing America's future energy and that sort of information helps us better understand how in the long term we can start building this coalition of people on maybe the other side of the aisle that we might have not thought would be supportive of electric vehicles, who are very receptive to this type of argument for a transition in transportation fuel. And so why is reducing our reliance on foreign oil so important? And for one, spending gas money on your utility instead of course, sending it overseas can help keep capital in your local community and create jobs in that community. But on top of that, it will reduce a community's susceptibility to oil shocks. And so this is going to become increasingly salient as time goes on because, as I mentioned before, many nations and cities are building demand for electric vehicles, which means that the demand for oil is going to shrink over time. And as we can see from this figure, the amount of decrease in oil demand is going to keep continuing to climb over a period of time. And this figure pretty much shows that by 2040, about 25% of OPEC's output is going to be cut, which increases the risk of an oil shock that's going to then be passed on communities that are still reliant on gasoline and diesel. And so, as I said before, this can result in stronger and more economically dangerous shocks that can hurt communities that don't have any other transportation fuel options. And so it's really important for us to start thinking through how, if we don't bring the entire state along in this sort of evolution of transportation, we can leave communities at a bigger risk for these sort of economic issues. And so now moving on to electric vehicles. Bloomberg New Energy Finance has estimated that by 2040, 55% of all car sales will be electric, and 33% of the global fleet will be electric by this time. But concerns still remain about this transition and around the practicability for people everywhere to be able to use electric vehicles and the costs for everyone. And of course, these concerns are mainly about the range and the upfront cost to purchase. And so, if we discuss the range, one of the primary concerns for electric vehicles is around the range based upon a single charge. And this concern is referred to as range anxiety. It's prevalent in more rural communities and within professions that have to drive hundreds of miles a day. It becomes then less convenient to recharge instead of refilling your gas tank, especially because we don't have built out charging infrastructure. And because of that, it's justifiable that there is concern at this point that the technology hasn't caught up. And so for most EVs to this point, they've had ranges of between like 100 to 200 miles. And this works well currently for everyday commuting within a city or a suburb where you drive, maybe about 60 miles a day and you can charge it overnight. But it doesn't work as much for longer traveling. Luckily, battery technology is rapidly progressing. And as this figure shows, models available with longer ranges are beginning to boom. As time goes on, we see that the number of cars in the 250 to 300 range continue to climb. And with new battery technology, we're going to be having even newer opportunities for longer range. And the bigger concern, at least from my vantage point moving forward, is that we don't have enough charging infrastructure for people. So it's not as much, of course, the range needs to get longer, but we need to have more points for people to be charging. And in order to make electric vehicles a possibility for everyone, we're going to really need to focus and begin installing these charging stations across the state so that electric vehicles can become a reality for everyday Washingtonians, regardless of their geographic location within the state. And so now moving on to costs. The biggest barrier for purchasing electric vehicles remains the upfront cost, or what's sometimes referred to as the sticker price. Total cost of ownership for an electric vehicle is actually lower than that of a standard gasoline car, but that's due to the fuel costs and the maintenance costs. Currently, it's estimated that fuel costs are about 1/4 for an electric vehicle, where the maintenance costs are about 1/2. And that's due to there's just a lot less moving parts within an electric vehicle. However, if we look over at the figure that I have here from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, we see that around mid to mid-late 2020s is when even the sticker price of an electric vehicle is going to fall below that of a gasoline or a diesel car. And that's what the yellow line that says ICE medium represents, ICE internal combustion engine, which is synonymous for the gasoline and diesel vehicles, at least in the case of this presentation. But as we can see, as time goes on, the cost continues to go down because the battery technology becomes more and more efficient and becomes less and less expensive. And so this next slide just sort of looks at that same graph, but for different types or different car segments. So we have the small segment, medium segment, we have SUVs, and large segment, which is supposed to represent, trucks and larger vehicles. And so what we can see based upon this is that, across the board, the price comes down not because of decreasing in the actual sort of vehicle or powertrain part, but because the battery is going to continue to get less and less expensive, which is why then around 2026, 2027, across the board, across all segment types, we see that the upfront cost is going to become less than their ICE components, which then when we put that reduced upfront cost in conjunction with the reduced fuel costs and reduced maintenance costs, we're then going to see that electric vehicles are going to become a much cheaper alternative for people to start using. So now we're going to move on to the supply chain discussion. So most of the supply chain concerns that we hear about are in relation to the extraction and the sourcing of metals. The primary three metals of concern are cobalt, lithium, and copper. And the rise of EVs will impact the demand for metals found in rechargeable batteries, like the ones found in our phones and our laptops. And the figure to the right shows that the metals that are going to be, that we'll see the biggest demand spike are going to be in lithium and cobalt. And of these, cobalt's the only one that they believe faces a risk in supply. And so as a result, we have companies that are putting a lot of research into developing and looking at other battery technologies like ceramic and glass batteries, which of course then are going to be using less of these metals. But also cobalt, as we'll discuss later, has a very high rate of recyclability, and there's already been movement to incorporate a lot more of recycled cobalt into the production of batteries, not just for electric vehicles, but of course for our laptops and phones and anything that uses a rechargeable lithium ion based battery. But one of the big concerns about cobalt and sort of the big underlying theme with supply chain concerns is that cobalt, there's a high rate of child labor within the supply chain. And about 60% of all cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there are child labor and human rights concerns. And so companies are now beginning to address these concerns by either sourcing elsewhere or relying more on recycled cobalt. And companies like HP and Samsung and Sony have joined in an effort called the Responsible Cobalt Initiative. And that pledges to follow global guidelines on mining supply chains. And other companies are following suit. Currently, as it's mentioned here, about 15% of US cobalt consumption already comes from recycled sources. And because cobalt, along with copper, their recyclability, I believe for cobalt is almost 100%, and copper is pretty high as well. Copper, though, because there's such abundant supply, it's currently cheaper to mine new copper than it is to recycle, but they know that they can recycle a lot of it. And so we expect for this percentage of US cobalt consumption to begin inching closer and closer to 100% recycled, both because it's probably going to be easier to source not from the Congo, and since there is already a concern about just total supply, if it's 100% recyclable, we're probably going to there's going to be a point where a lot of the cobalt that we consume is going to be recycled and not mined. And so moving forward, though, we still need to do a lot of work to make sure that these companies and where we source our metals, that we have a clean supply chain that does not rely on child labor or violate human rights. But luckily, this is a more solvable problem. We're aware of how we can fix it rather than the current status quo, which we know oil, even if it had a completely clean supply chain, the consumption and the burning of it, as we've become aware of, is pretty damaging to the environment. So regardless, we have to find a different source and a different way to move around. So in conclusion, based upon everything that I've discussed, there are multiple benefits to adopting electric vehicles, and there are several areas that we can innovate and improve. As mentioned before, switching to electric vehicles will reduce carbon emissions, especially as the world is racing towards renewable electricity sources. There are concerns about whether or not switching to EVs is safe for the environment. And of course, if you're using coal-fired electricity, it's not as great, but because especially in Washington State, we have such a high rate of renewables, it's a great way for us to be cutting down on our carbon dioxide emissions. And so by switching over to this new type of transportation, we will be able to protect the planet for future generations. Is that somebody's phone? Okay. And so reducing also our gasoline use will protect our health and the health of communities. As I said before, it's going to reduce risk collectively for heart, brain, respiratory complications, pregnancy complications, and in the long run benefit all of us significantly. And so, and moving on to the economic components, switching to electric vehicles is going to create jobs locally and reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and also reduce the strain on the pocketbook of everyday Washingtonians if they're saving money on fuel costs and they're not subject to economic forces that are halfway around the world. That will benefit them in the long run. And looking at where we're going to need to be improving and what we need to be advocating for and pushing for is, in order for everyone to feel these benefits, we need to invest in infrastructure. We need to make charging easy and accessible for everyone, because as the upfront costs of electric vehicles come down and the range continues to grow, no one should be shut out of partaking in this evolution of transportation. And lastly, we're going to need to make sure that we eradicate the use of child labor and human rights abuses in the supply chain. Our technology progress cannot come at the expense of others. And so we have an amazing opportunity to lead as a state in this evolution of transportation. And it's time for us to make the appropriate investments to do so.